Well, good afternoon. I am Reverend Sherry L. Jackson, based in Alexandria, Louisiana, and this is Understanding the Old Testament, and we are in our 16th lesson. We are in Exodus. We started Exodus last week, and we are continuing. And if you have been keeping up with our lessons, you know that this is a part of the grand narrative of God redeeming or reconciling his people back to him. So tonight we will continue with Moses, and we will do a little review before we get into chapter 3 and 4 tonight. We want to make sure that we are all on mute. So please take the time to do that if you are not muted just yet. So let's review. We said that Moses is the author of Exodus. In fact, Moses is the author of the first 5 books known as the Pentateuch, the Torah, or the Law. These writings took place between 1446 and 1406. And you will see these dates for Genesis, Exodus, the first 5. You're going to have all of the dates, these dates basically around the same time for all the first 5 books. Now, we do know that Moses was not in Genesis happenings, but these were the things that were revealed to him. Well, so some of the key points or the key truths of Exodus is that the Lord authorized Moses as Israel's leader to bring the blessings of deliverance from Egypt. And we know when we ended chapter 50, that Joseph, who had been the principal character from chapter 37 through 50, died. Moses had completed Joseph had completed his task and had gone as far as his purpose would take him. And now the children or the promise of Abraham has multiplied, and they became slaves in Egypt. And so as our story is moving along, God is preparing Moses to bring his people out of bondage. Now, again, if Abraham's family was going to be a great nation, well, it does not make sense for them to be in bondage. So God had to bring them out of bondage, and he did it through Moses. Also in Exodus, we will deal with the covenant laws that were given to Moses from God. Moses is going to get the regulations for the tabernacle. We will see the first, the beginnings of God setting his house of worship, his dwelling place in line, how they were to worship, who was to go into the tabernacle, how they were going to be arranged. And remember, these people had been in slavery, so they still had a slave mentality. God is going to have to give them every detail, because at this point they are not a nation. They are just basically a whole lot of people. So the Hebrews lived 400 years in Egypt. They were fruitful and multiplied, and this is what got Pharaoh all up in arms, because they were just so many of them, and in order for them not to overtake Egypt, then Pharaoh made them slaves. And so once it seemed like the hard work was not going to tame them. He ordered them to kill their male children at birth. We know the story of the midwives, which we talked about last week, that they devised a plan that they were not going to kill the baby boys. And then the next thing, Pharaoh said, okay, well, we're going to drown the boy. We're going to drown the boys. Since they are coming alive, the midwife said, look, these women, you know, they are so strong, they're so powerful. By the time they get there, the baby's already there. So Pharaoh said, okay, well, since that's happening, we're going to drown them. But Moses, who was a Levite, was born, hidden, then found and raised by the daughter of Pharaoh. When he grew up, Moses killed an Egyptian and had to flee. Moses fled to Midian. Remember, we talked about that last week. He fled and he stayed there about 40 years. And during that time, he married. He had a son. And so after that, as we enter into chapter 3, we are going to see that the Lord appeared to Moses in a burning bush, called him to rescue the Hebrews from Egypt. So Moses is in Midian where he fled, but that is not the end of his story. Now let's just put a pin right there. How many times have we done things that by man standards or even the civil law or the government would say, hey, we're going to just write you off? Moses murdered a man. And then not only when he murdered somebody, and then when he saw another somebody else fighting, he had the nerve to say, you know, try to get upset about it. And they said, well, how dare you tell us to stop doing the very thing that you did? And so Moses feared for his life. He fled to Midian, but that was not the end of his story. Even a murderer, God still had purpose for. And so God appears to Moses in a burning bush, and he's going to use Moses and going to send him back to Egypt, the very place that he fled, to rescue and to bring back the people. So let us get our Bibles together, and we're going to Exodus 3. Exodus 3. And it says, now Moses was pasturing the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. He led the flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Oreb, the mountain of God. The angel of the Lord appeared to him in a blazing fire from the midst of the bush. And he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, yet the bush was not consumed. Now that is what we would consider a strange sight. Why did God use a burning bush to get Moses' attention? Now remember, this was in the wilderness, and so burning bushes were a common sight. You know, you're in the hot desert area. So Moses must have seen hundreds of them before. This was not something new, but there was something different about this bush. The problem was, the difference was, this bush did not, the fire did not consume the bush. In other words, the bush looked exactly as if there was no fire. Okay, so again, it was not the fire, the bush that was on fire that was the problem, but the problem was that it was burning, but it was still green. He could not have seen that the bush wasn't burning, though it was inflamed, unless he had paid close attention. Again, it's like a common thing that we see all of the time, and we just pass it up because that's a common occurrence. However, when there is something out of the ordinary about something that we've been seeing all the time, it gets our attention. And this is exactly what happened to Moses. And then why the burning bush? Because in everything that happens in life, we can ask God, what's your purpose behind this incident? You know, what are you trying to say? God was saying that this bush represented the beginning of something that was going to take place, that was going to transform not only Moses, it was going to transform history, it was going to transform Israel. And it was the beginning of God's direct intervention into the affairs of history. So this was not just something just to get Moses' attention, but anytime fire represented God's presence. Fire represented God's presence. God had virtually been silent for about 400 years. And so when he comes out, when God appears, he appears in a big way. And the question remains, can Moses handle this job? Why perhaps did God come in such a big way? God wanted to see if Moses could pay attention to the small, insignificant things. Again, a bush that was burning in the wilderness was not an unusual thing. But Moses was going to have to, he could have easily just said, okay, oh, that's just another bush burning in the wilderness. But Moses paid attention. And so God was perhaps trying to figure out, if I got this big job for Moses, but if I can't get him to pay attention to these details, how in the world is he going to pay attention or handle this big job that I'm about to give him? And so Moses was going to have to deal with hundreds and thousands of people. And so God wants to know, can Moses handle the job? How many times we want to jump to big jobs? We want to jump to the what we would consider the significant things, and not want to deal with the small things. But don't despise the day of small beginnings, because anytime God is involved, no matter how big or how small, there is purpose to it. And so the job that Moses was going to have was going to require discernment, wisdom, and patience. Therefore, no one can fulfill greater tasks of God if they are not sensitive to the smaller things. Take care of the small things. You know, there's this saying, the devil is in the details. The devil is in the details. And I know a lot of times, even for me, I miss some of the smaller details because I'm such a big picture person. But in this instance, God wants to know, can Moses handle the job? Any questions, any comments at this point right now? Okay, so when we get to Moses' call, God is calling Moses for the job. And there are certain patterns in the Bible, what we call them patterns, motifs, themes. And one of the patterns or motifs or theme is a call narrative. It's a pattern that you will see over and over whenever God calls someone, when God used this method to call a prophet or another or other important person. And so through these scriptures, we're going to walk through this call pattern. And you're going to see the same kind of pattern when God called Isaiah, when God called Gideon, when God called Jeremiah, when God called Sherry, when God called Joe Green, Gloria Williams, when God called whoever. There are just certain things that we always end up doing. And you can just mark your own paper and to see how you fit into it. And I'm not necessarily talking about call to preach, but it's something that God has called us to, that we go through the changes, so to speak, when we don't want to do it. But what does a call narrative look like? There is several parts. One is the divine confrontation. 2 is an introductory word. 3 is commission. 4 is objection. Then there's reassurance, and then there is a sign. So let's go through each one of them. And again, mark your own paper, and I bet you will see yourself in this call. We've already read 3:1 through 4, and that's why it's called a divine confrontation. What we need to understand is that Moses' call began with God appearing in a form of a burning bush. And Moses is tending sheep near Mount Orb or Mount Sinai. Now, Moses is minding his own business. He's busy doing the work that he's tending sheep. Now, where do we remember Mount Sinai? And there was another place that Mount Sinai that we kind of like remember that. Do we remember that from any other place? What happened on Mount Sinai? Do we remember that, Pastor Green?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, sir.
Okay. I was concerned about being on. I hope in our study tonight, as we look to Moses right now in the call narrative, that we don't forget that his birth was special. He was first raised by a foster mother who was his mother that God had put there to take care of him. He was educated in all the arts and sciences of Egypt for 40 years. So here is a highly intelligent, intellectual giant who, as you said earlier, killed a man. And now 40 years he was in school being trained and prepared to take over as a pharaoh. Then after he murdered this Egyptian, he spent 40 years in the Medium Desert learning to be a shepherd, and as a shepherd, and if we think about this before it's called, a shepherd did not only take care of animals, but a shepherd was one who took care of villages, community needs, and even kings were called shepherds who took care of people. So paying attention to detail, as you said, learning how to manage people, learning how to manage a budget and skills, all of this 80 years of preparation was there before he got his divine call. And sometimes, most of us have been trained in other skills and professions before we get our divine call. And yet all the training that we've had prepares us for the next level of work. I hope that makes sense to us.
Certainly. From the foundation of time, God, and that's what we're going to see, that when Moses, all this preparation, all this time, we see that Moses is really leading up to this. And then we can just think about in our own lives that as I can look back over my life, I can tell today how everything marched up to the day that I accepted my call. But there is, and we're going to see through Moses's call, I know some of the things that I did or did not do. So Moses, again, is doing what Moses was doing. He was tending his sheep and minding his own business when God appeared to him. Now, there is this word theophany, and that is a visible manifestation of God, which is usually restricted to the Old Testament. So God appears in and is given like human characteristics, or he appears in a way that people understand that it's God, sometimes and sometimes not, but they you don't see God's face. So let's look at 8 characteristics of what happens when God shows up. 8 characteristics of theophany. The first thing is, it is temporary. God shows up for a particular purpose and he goes away. The bush burns, get Moses' attention. God does what he needs to do with Moses and he leaves. So a theophany is temporary. The second thing is a theophany. When God appears or shows up, he shows up either to save, to offer salvation, or to bring judgment. To save, to offer salvation, or to bring judgment. The third thing is holiness. He sanctifies the location. He makes it holy. So when God shows up, he says, look, Moses, this place where you are standing is holy ground. Not that the ground in itself was special, but because God was there. The bush burning was a theophany of God. And so God says, take off of your shoes, because this place right here is holy ground. When God does show up in these ways, he partially reveals himself and he partially conceals himself. Because remember, he said, now I can only let you see my backside. So he's partially there, but he's partially not. And when this happens, when one realizes that it is God, there is fear on the human side. The natural phenomenon is that God shows up sometimes in a disturbance of a natural environment, like he shows up in the wind, he shows up in the storm. So these are ways that God shows up to let us know that it is God, or at least he reveals himself as that. When he shows up, there's something called eschatology, and eschatology is the study of end times. We get a glimpse of God in the end time, and also God shows up, he appears to give a message. And a lot of times you see this phrase, the angel of the Lord, or an angel of the Lord appeared. So when you see that phrase, it is really God showing up. It is really God showing up. And so this is called a theophany, when God appears sometime with human characteristics, sometime in nature as this burning bush, sometimes in the wind, and it is temporary. It is a God comes to do what he has to do, then he leaves. So let's continue with this call narrative. So when we get to verses 4 through, so the first thing is there is a divine confrontation. In other words, God shows up. God shows up, agitates your day, stops you in your track, gets your attention. And then the second thing is introductory words. So when we get to verse 4, when the Lord saw that he turned aside to look, when he got Moses' attention, God called to him in the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. Now, the first thing we need to understand is that God makes the initial contact. God initiates the relationship and the conversation. He calls Moses by name. Now, we don't know about, how all of this took place, but Moses simply says, here am I. When God calls us, God initiates the relationship. God initiates the conversation. So that's why he said we are answering the call, because God spoke first. So he says, all Moses said is, here am I. Moses is not agreeing to anything. He really doesn't know a whole lot about who this God is, but Moses simply says, here am I. Moses is my name. If I call Lakeitha's name, or Tara's name, or Joe's name, or Fred's name, and you say, yes, here am I, it's me. So this is what is taking place here. So God says, do not come near, remove your sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. Now again, not that the ground was so special, but the fact that God was there, God was present, and any place that God shows up becomes holy ground. Not because of us, but because of God. So Moses is simply saying, here am I. God says, take off your sandals. This is holy ground. Don't you contaminate with, you need to be free of the sandals off of your feet. So God continues, says, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. So now again, God reveals himself as the God of the patriarchs, the God of the fathers. Now that's very important, because this was a time when there were lots of gods. And remember, Moses has grown up in Pharaoh's house. So he would have been accustomed to all of the Egyptian gods. So God said, I need to distinguish myself from all of those gods and say who I am. I'm different from those gods. See, God has to begin to establish this relationship between the people and him, and to say, look, I'm different from the sun god, the moon god, the cow god. I'm different. I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so Moses hides his face because of fear of the sight of God. Now, again, he doesn't see God's face. Remember that word theophany. God shows up in the bush. And if you can see, this takes place right here on Mount Sinai. So now Moses was over here in the land of Midian, but he is watching his father-in-law's sheep, Jethro's sheep, remember? And so this is where God gets him away from what he knew. God has a pattern of getting us away from our comfort zone and getting us away from what we are familiar with to have an encounter with us. So it says that Moses was afraid. The Lord said, I'm in verse 7, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have given heed to their cry because of their taskmasters, for I am aware of their suffering. This verse tells exactly what it's all about. I have heard, I have seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their cry, and I'm coming to do something about it. Moses is only the vessel by which God is going to use to take care of his people. Now that's something worth noting right there, that whenever God calls us into service, it is not about us. It is not about our goodness. Remember, Moses had a rap sheet, but it was about God using Moses to deliver his people. It is all about God's people. He said, so I have come down to deliver them from the power of the Egyptians and to bring them up from the land to a good and spacious land, to a land flowing with milk and honey. Now behold, the cry of the sons of Israel has come to me. Furthermore, I have seen them oppression for which the Egyptians are oppressing them. So up until the time that Moses says, here I am, God has been talking. God is telling Moses what this is all about. Are we together? Okay.
We are together.
Okay. You wanted to add something?
I might, if I can.
You can.
You were clever to point out to us that when God called us, he called us where we are, at whatever we're doing and whatever exists in our life prior to the call. Mm-hmm. Because the call from God is not about us. It's about the purpose and mission that he know we are suited to fill. He never makes a mistake in who he calls. He knows our purpose. He knows why. And he has already equipped us with all the traits, the attributes, personality, and what we need to do what he wants us to do. The strength in what you're doing tonight as we study this word, Reverend Jackson, is that he wants to sharpen our tools so that we will be able to do what he's called us to do in a competent and compassionate and compelling way. And I know from experience, if we follow God, we will do exactly what God wants us to do. And it's not about us individually. It's about the greater good that he called us to do. And Moses is now enlisted or have been drafted to do God's will, what he was born to do. It was in him from the beginning, but it took 80 years to get him to the place he needed to be. Whether he waited or did not wait, God still knew where he was at all times, what his purpose was to be, and how he was going to get him there. Interesting story.
It's an interesting story that took place thousands and thousands of years ago, but it is still relevant today as we think about the times that God has called us. Again, I'm not just talking about preaching. Whatever it is God has given us to do, God initiates. And I always say, be weary of someone who is just so anxious to go off to do something in this arena, because it's at least all the preachers that I know come in contact with, they would tell you, this is not something that I wanted to do. If it was up to me, and I'll say, Sherry, if it was up to me, this would not be what I would want to do. But God does the initiating. God does the initiating. God appears while, I'll tell you, I was minding my own business, doing very well in Racine, Wisconsin, moving up the newspaper chain, when God said, Sherry, Sherry. And it took me a long time to say, here am I. But we'll continue through this process. So the third thing is the commission. When we look at verse 10, God commissions him or appoints him or tells him what he's going to do. He said, therefore, come now, and I will send you to Pharaoh, so that you may bring my people, the sons of Israel, out of Egypt. So God says, Moses, Moses, here am I. Moses, I'm going to send you. This is your job. I'm going to send you to Pharaoh. Now, God is not saying how it was going to be done, how long it was going to be done, but he says, I'm going to send you. So God is giving him his marching orders. God had already began to work on Israel's behalf. So he says, now go. I'm sending you. Again, Moses is the messenger of God who received news of what Yahweh intends to do for Israel. Moses, as a prophet, announced the redemptive act of Yahweh. Again, remember, Exodus is a salvation story. It is a salvation story of how God delivered his people. And that's what a salvation is. The salvation story is God delivering us, God snatching us from the penalty of God, snatching us from danger, basically. And this is what God is doing with Moses, who's going to deliver. He's going to be the acting agent. Moses is a type of Christ. And what do I mean? Moses gives us a glimpse of the work that Christ will do on Calvary. Moses delivered the people, children of Israel. Christ delivered us. So Moses gets his commission in verse 10. He gets his marching order. So Moses, he got away from Egypt, and then he's going to have to return to Egypt to begin doing what God wanted him to do. So Moses doesn't just magically appear in Exodus 3. As Pastor Green said, this has been an ongoing event. Moses may have seemed like he was oblivious, but when you look at the details of his birth, the rescue from the river, the escape from Egypt to Midian, we will conclude that Moses is strategically placed in the desert. Now just pause and think for a minute how God has strategically placed us in position where we figure, you know, what am I doing here? But it's all about the grand scheme. It's all about the grand narrative. God, when he heard the cries of Israel, he got to work. And he began to activate what he had already had in mind. It was no surprise to God. So Moses was strategically placed where he was. And this commission is in response to God hearing the cries of his people. And that was in Exodus 2:24. So Moses is a means to an end, which is to lead those out of bondage, those in bondage out of bondage, out of their oppression, physical oppression, mental oppression, and spiritual oppression. My brothers and sisters, whenever God calls us, whenever he commissions us, he sends us out. We are only vessels. We are not the star of the show. We are only acting on God's behalf. Brother Fred, you have a question? Okay. So there's a commission, and yes, indeed, there are objections. Moses had a whole lot of excuses. So from chapter 3:11 all the way to 4:13, Moses spends his time with some excuses of why he cannot do the job. Why he cannot do the job. Fred, did you have a question?
No.
Okay.
No.
I see this arrow here pointing, so I don't know what that means.
Okay, that means I was playing around.
Okay. Okay. Okay, so the objections. Let's look at the objections, and you can just fill in the blank which one fits you. He first says, I am not qualified to fulfill my calling. I am not qualified to fulfill my calling. Moses said to God, well, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and that I should bring the sons of Israel out of Egypt? So he says, I'm not qualified to do this job. How many times have we used that excuse? And I remember when I was at the newspaper in Wisconsin, and I would see all of these, promotions posted, board jobs posted. And I would say, oh, I can't do that. I'm not gonna apply that, or I can't. I'm not qualified to do that. Or if somebody asks me to do something, no, I don't think I know how to do that. Now, here's something strange. Moses says, I'm not qualified, but where did Moses grow up? He grew up in Pharaoh's house. So if he was not qualified, who would have been qualified? He was once a member of Pharaoh's house, but now he was a shepherd. So he's saying, look, you're going to send me a shepherd, the lowest of the low. And if you know anything about shepherds being out with the sheep, they ought to smell like the sheep. So therefore, they're not smelling all that good. And so Moses says, it's been 40, he's basically saying it's been 40 years since I've been in Egypt. I'm 80 years old. I'm an old man. I'm past the average life. And so Moses got to thinking, look, I'm not the right person. But look what God says in 3:2. and 12. God said, certainly I will be with you. Now that's a very important phrase. I will be with you. But Moses doesn't give up. He says in 13, I lack knowledge to fulfill my calling. Moses knew that that should he go up to the children of Israel, they were bound to be some questions like, who is this God that sent you to us? Why are we to leave this country we have come to consider our home for 400 years? And just think about again, who is this God? Is this Isis? Is this the sun god? Is this the moon god, the plant god, the water god? What God is this? And Moses is going to come back and ask this question. Well, who shall I say? Because they're going to ask me. Who shall I say sent me? And so God said, if we continue on in 13, Moses said to him, behold, I am going to the Son, the God of your fathers that sent me to you. Now they may say, what is his name? And what shall I say to them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, thus shall you say unto the sons, I am sent you. So Moses continued on, even so, he says, I do not believe I can fulfill my calling. This is not my calling. I do not want to fulfill my calling. But God tells him, I will be with you. So now there's some objections. Remember, we're still in the call narrative. There's the commission. God tells us what the job is. We say, no, I can't do it because, and God gives us reassurances. I will be with you. I will be with you. But again, Moses still doesn't know who this God is. Who this God is, because God is just now forming this relationship with Moses. Now remember, we are on this side of Calvary. We know the rest of the story. Moses did not have this this luxury. This is all new to Moses. So God reassures him, I will be with you. Well, who is this I? Who do I say, when they ask me all those questions? Tell them that I am who I am. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more. But as we continue on with the call narrative, God says, I'm going to send you, there's going to be a sign. We always asking for a sign. So God says in verse 12b, I'm going to be with you. And this is a sign. This shall be the sign to you that it is who I am. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall worship God at this mountain. In other words, Moses was over here in Mount Sinai. He says, the way you're going to know if it's me is that when you have completed the task, you have gone to Egypt, got the people back, and you get back to this mountain and worship me, then you're going to know. Now that's God having a sense of humor. I'm more than sure Moses wanted a sign right now. But God said the way that you're going to know is that when you make it to Egypt, when you bring the people back, then you're going to worship in this same place. You're going to know that it was me. You're going to know. So again, the call narrative. Now, have you seen yourself somewhere in this call narrative? in the objections. You've heard God call your name. You've heard God tell you exactly what it is. You've had your excuses. But God said, I'm going to show you. I'm going to give you something to let you know it's me. And he's going to give you some assurances. I'm going to be with you. Pastor Green, I see you're trying to get in.
Yes, I hope that during the course of examining and re-examining this narrative that we see ourselves, and that we see ourselves to the point to where we recognize we may not always know who calls us at first. Mm-hmm. Moses was in a rare position because as God called him and then said to him, I've heard the cry of my people and I have come down to deliver them. Then the next thing is say, Moses, I'm sending you to Pharaoh. You pointed out earlier that our call is not necessarily to preach, mm-hmm. but it's greater than that. It's about meeting the needs of God's people. And Moses is going to have what we call a physical salvation, a physical deliverance of the children of Israel from Egypt. And sometimes we want to make everything spiritual. Well, this was a physical deliverance, a physical experience, he physically walked the people out of Egypt into a new area, the Sinai Peninsula, in order that they could become a nation, slaves first, organize them to become a people, and then to receive rules and regulations, some of us call laws or commandments, that will govern them after they become a nation. So its call was bigger than just saying, Pharaoh, let the children go. It was walking them out of Egypt and walking with them to become a nation or the people of God. This is a powerful, powerful narrative that you're sharing with us. Hopefully that we could see ourselves and know that it's bigger than just preaching or teaching.
Certainly. When God calls us, it's about his agenda and not about ours. Oftentimes we do our own thing and ask God to bless it, when it should be, God, where are you working? Where do you want me to work? And you follow that. And so when we follow God's plan for us, God doesn't have a problem blessing that. It's when we do things and then ask God to bless it without consulting him to see even if that's where we should be. And so again, Moses asked, well, when they ask me, who should I say sent me? And God said, you tell them that I am who I am. Now, what we really need to understand is God's name is not God. God's name is not God. God is a title. It is not God's name. That's why people have various forms, various things that they call God, but G-O-D is not his name. But let's just take a look at when he says, I am who I am. All of the other gods, and we're going to take a look at them when we look at the plagues, your name symbolized what you did. So if the sun god, and I forget what that name was, I think it may have been Ra, R-A. But if your name was the sun god, well, you were living, all you could do is be the sun god, the S-U-N. If you were the rain god, all you could do is be the rain god or the cow god or whatever it is. So God said, look, I'm not going to put no boundaries on my name. So you just tell them, I am who I am. So that leaves it wide open. Whatever you want me to be, whenever you want me to be it, I am. Does that make sense? God said, I'm not going to limit myself. So therefore, and also when we dealt with these Egyptians gods, they only had territory where they were. So in other words, if you are in Alexandria, your God can only be the God of Alexandria. But when you went to Pineville, that God had no jurisdiction. So God, Yahweh, said, I am. So I am is a English translation to the meaning of God's personal name, which is Yahweh. Now, in the original version of God's name, there were no vowels. So when we translated it and got to the English, it ends up being Yahweh. Okay, it ends up being Yahweh. So God gives his name, but he says, look, Moses, I know that you are looking for a name. Because Moses said, look, when they ask me, when the elders ask me and they want to know who it is, what am I going to tell them? Tell them that I am. Because in the Near Eastern culture, the name of the person who existed was a necessary part of his existence, and one knew a reality or a God only if they knew his name. So Moses knew that they were going to want to know who this God was that you're talking about. Now, of course, they would have been talking about a small G-O-D, but God gives his name. He says, my name is forever. It is a active being. So when you see I am, if you think about in the English verse or in the English class or in your language art class, it is a perpetual being. I am today, what I am tomorrow, what I was yesterday. I am. It is forever. There are no boundaries. There are no boundaries. So God is he who is. He is the self-existent one. He who is ever becoming what he is. And I like to say it is the isness of God. He is. It is always. And so remember when we get to John 10, and we like to call those the I ams. I am the bread of life. I am it's the same translation. What I am right here to Moses, I am in the incarnate Christ. I'm the same, I'm made of the same stuff. I am. So as we have talked about Moses and his call, I'm sure that you had an opportunity to think about the times that God have commissioned you and called you into something and you just did not want to do it. Is there anybody who's bold enough to share that tonight when God called you into something and you went through the objection and you finally said, after sometimes maybe years, maybe not yet, but you know that God has called you to something. I'm going to stop the recording, and that way we can talk freely.